Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third in our series of 5 seminars on neurodiversity within the workplace. For those of you who are new to this series, we have had Seminar 1, which looked at neurodiversity and how greater neurodiversity can benefit your organisation. In Seminar 2, we looked at the barriers to entry and promotion within the workplace for neurodiverse staff. Both of those videos are available on YouTube, so do go and have a look at them. But today we're going to look at session 3, lifting the barriers, removing the fear. The next session, we're going to have a Q&A panel discussion on lessons learned, and session 5, we're going to as a panel, look at and respond to some of the particular questions and discussion points that have been raised during the course of the series. In terms of housekeeping issues, we're going to speak for hopefully no more than 30 or 40 minutes and take questions afterwards for 15 or 10 minutes after that. You'll see that there is a Q&A box where you can post your questions, please, rather than the chat function. And we'll get to as many as we can, but we really want these sessions to spark debate and discussions. And we would encourage you to make observations or raise topics that you would like the speakers to explore a bit further in some of our Q&A sessions, as well as, of course, as raising some questions. So our speakers today are Gillian Burgess-Smith and Jack Fitzpatrick from Inclusive Environments Limited, Liz Norman from ENI, Recruitment Consultants, and myself. I head up the employment team at Edwin Co. It's a full-service law firm based in Lincoln's Inn. And as a team, we work with employers and senior executives, and we are increasingly dealing with complex disability discrimination issues, which can include issues arising in connection with neurodiverse staff. My pronouns are she and her, and my values are honesty, transparency, and empathy. We will all be dealing with different aspects of the seminar today. I'm going to try to remove some of the fear of dealing with issues when problems arise and show how a structured approach to those issues can really help identify the solutions. I'm now going to hand over to Liz to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Liz Norman. I am the founder of a recruitment consultancy in the insight profession. My values are knowledgeable, empathetic, collaborative, progressive, and curious. And my experience of recruiting in this area, both good and bad, but I'm learning a lot as I go along, and what are some of the best things that we can do, and some of the problems and how we can overcome them.
Hi, I'm Jack Fitzpatrick. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the co-founder of Inclusive Environments Limited. I'm a person with lived experience and have just completed my BA Honours degree in Education Studies and Inclusion. I describe myself as neurodiverse through having a diagnosis of autism and dyspraxia from the age of 3 years old. And my values are honesty, integrity, and being inclusive. I'll hand over to Gillian.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm the other co-founder with Jack from Inclusive Environments Limited. My pronouns are she and her. By profession, I'm a chartered architect, but I often say to people, if I wasn't an architect, I'd love to be a psychologist, because I love looking at how people use spaces and to enable people to reach their full potential. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with an incurable brain tumour, which actually has left me neurodegenerative. And as such, actually recognising some of the challenges that people that have invisible disabilities have within the workplace. So the reasons for our sort of research and starting this company. My values are caring, patience, and empathy. So what we wanted to look at today, so Jack and I are talking really around adaptable and appropriate working spaces and top tips for people when they're thinking about employing people that might be neurodiverse. So these are the tips that I would recommend. So I think the first thing is to really create awareness and promote a diverse workforce, and essentially as well, environments where neurodiverse individuals can feel comfortable. And this is around disclosure, it's around actually bringing their full selves to work. And one way to do this could be to create sort of ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups and resource circles. And we've recently done this with aggregate industries. So Jack, do you just want to describe what the ERGs do and where we can help with them, and also around learning circles?
Yeah, so my role within aggregate industries, which I was working with them on a placement for 18 months last year, was to look at and evaluate the EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion corporate culture. And as part of this, employee resource groups, which are groups of staff or employees at various positions within the company, define themselves as either being neurodiverse or have an LGBT background or age, as well as gender. And these groups are part of a top-down, bottom-up type of strategy that the organisation has taken, in which part of this is allowing the employees to be part of the decision making, and these smaller decisions get fed up to more of the senior management to influence the corporate culture. They've also implemented listening circles, and listening circles are people with lived experience, such as myself, giving their story, their personal journey and story to the employees and staff members across the organisation. Anyone can come onto the call and listen. These at the moment are done virtually, but there is room that maybe to do these in person. And these listening circles have created profound change within the organisation, as people are more tolerant and respectful because they understand the different backgrounds and diversity that are within the organisation. And I'll hand over to Julie.
Thank you, Jack. No, I love that. It's really about sort of changing the culture of the organisation to make people more aware and to also increase empathy. We've also heard of similar companies, and you may be a smaller company that think, well, we're not really big enough to have separate sort of employee resource groups or affinity groups around certain areas. But there are actually other things. So you can actually signpost any employee to LinkedIn. There are lots of groups on LinkedIn for neurodiversity. There are Twitter groups that we've heard that people have actually belonged to. And indeed, through the pandemic, a lot of people actually got a diagnosis of ADHD or autism and sort of went to have a look at the Twitter groups. And also there's other organisations within our organisation. There is Ability RE, Ability Real Estate. So for anyone in real estate that actually has a diagnosis or empathises with neurodiversity can join that one. So the other thing for organisations, we say as a top tip, is not just to attract, and I know Lisa's going to talk to that, but also to retain, motivate a talent pool of neurodiverse individuals. So we've also heard of people that it doesn't stop at hiring, and we've heard of examples where people have disclosed during their recruitment process and that information wasn't passed to their manager, and then they weren't actually given the right modifications and adaptations that they needed to work. So for instance, they were really found time management very difficult, and they were being told, here are the tasks we need you to do, without any priorities or time limits around it. And they just struggled. And they then sat down with their manager and explained, actually, I find time management and that's a struggle really difficult. So could you break it into 45-minute chunks? That was done, and they were able to sort of reach more of their full potential. Also for individuals that maybe have a noise sensitivity that they haven't discussed. So sitting them in the middle of an open plan office next to a tea point and a microwave is really going to affect their performance in work. So it's around retaining, motivation and understanding. It's around using positive and inclusive language at all times. I know of one organisation that actually does 360 training on unconscious bias within that organisation. It's really important that you support, obviously, neurodiversity within the workplace, and be aware of your legal obligations. And I know Link is going to talk to this as well. And it's around reward and recognition. You know, I think the idea of having personal development reviews once a year, let's have them 4 times a year. Let's increase the frequency. Let's really understand how people are working and what they need. And Jack, I don't know if you want to talk about the gentleman on the right, and also I know you have some other positive examples of organisations that have taken this step to be more inclusive.
Yes, so the gentleman depicted in the picture there is Carl Nielsen, who originally was a coffee shop barista, but the Financial Times have written an article called "Hiring More Neurodiverse Workers Can Pay Dividends." He is now a data scientist working with Ernst Young, EY, and he has become more confident, more productive in the workplace because he feels that he's actually adding value to the organisation. And he's become the go-to person to deal with in-depth data and insights before it goes to the auditors in EY. And the article also highlights that and states that that not all autistic employees will thrive in the same roles, but believe that the condition is an alternative ability. It's a different way of looking at things. Our brains are wired slightly differently. That's not right or wrong. That does mean that we have different ways of looking at things and different interests that companies can benefit from. When we are using our own particular skills, whether that's in data analysis or processing or something that uses our focus, productivity, or enjoyment of structure and repetitive work, it's massively beneficial for us and our employees. We are not a pity hire. So Carl is also identifying as neurodiverse as well. And he's part of an initiative called the Neurodiversity Centre for Excellence that EY have just started to create more and more of across the UK, with a new one opening in Manchester. I think it's middle to late this year. And so another example of a company that is productively encouraging the hiring of neurodiverse employees is SAP, in which a manager of a 21-year-old autistic individual gave them the autonomy to look at the procurement processes when doing large invoices. Initially, from suppliers, it could involve upwards of 20 departments and therefore take days to process manually. But this person, in his spare time, created an automated process. So it now takes 20 minutes rather than several days. And this is the benefit of having people within companies who are neurodiverse. Another example is Microsoft, which within starting the program from 2015, more than 100 autistic staff have been hired within the company. And 4 times a year, candidates are given assessments tailored to break down any communication difficulties or challenges processing information they may have. The hiring process takes 5 days, in contrast with the usual Microsoft 1-day assessment, and they're given tasks to understand and have more detail in the role that they're going into as well. So being assessed on the job. And so yeah, I'll hand back to Gillian.
Thank you. I think we have a poll next. Actually, we wanted to reach out. So essentially, we'd like you to take part in this poll. So we've talked about some of the benefits in sort of some of our other seminars, but we're really interested to find out from the list below what you actually think the benefits of hiring neurodivergent professionals are. So answer A is access to different perspectives. B is increased innovation and creativity. C is brand improvement and recognition. D, all of the above. So you don't have to specify. E, I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet. Or F is other. If you answer other, we may actually ask you to say what other is. So either in the chat function or in the other. So here the poll is now on the screen. If you could complete, thank you. Perfect. Wow. Fantastic. So it's really good to see that. Well, 10% of you are access to perspectives. You hadn't really thought about increased innovation or brand improvement. Obviously, those are benefits as well. And 90% actually do recognise that these bring all of the above and more. I might ask Liz to talk about her poll. And then I'm glad that sort of none of you didn't know. So you're all aware and there was no other. So Liz, do you just want to come in and just mention the poll that you did?
So yes, I quickly did a poll on LinkedIn yesterday. We can only put in 3 possible responses on LinkedIn. So I just chose improved employee brand, different perspectives for loyal employees. And different perspectives was 91%, which actually quite surprised me that people were that welcoming of the different views that people like that. Oh, like that sounds terrible. I'm neurodiverse. People that are neurodiverse can bring. Yeah, and so it's they genuinely see the contribution, the positive contribution that the neurodiverse can bring.
And I think the other on here was that 0% was against loyal employees.
Yes.
In your poll.
Which in this market, you would think that would be important to people, but no.
No, well, I can tell you that Carl Nielsen EY is very loyal now, and he he loves that company. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about environments and breaking down those barriers. So the first slide on the left, the picture on the left there, is a reception. So I think it's important to make first impressions count. So, you know, for instance, that reception is really calming. It's not overwhelmed by too many visuals. You've just got the 3 colour contrast going on with the natural wood, the grey and the sort of planting. And it's just sort of welcoming. And one example that I always give is around toilets. So the middle there on the top is actually a toilet. And what I'm trying to say with that picture is you don't have to make disabled toilets that are generally on the ground floor of buildings when you go in ugly, because it doesn't give a nice first impression. If you could just paint it peach and maybe put some plants in there, people that go into the toilet before they actually go to their meetings will have a lot nicer impression of the people that they're going to see. And the example I also give, for me, it's wayfinding. So wayfinding in both directions. So, yeah, a lot of buildings actually don't think about their wayfinding, their signage, their lettering, the contrast and so forth, but it's really important to make that accessible. The photo below with the orange back and the green chairs, those are actually acoustic chairs. And that photo is actually from Auto Trader. And they recently adapted their open plan office and hot desking policies to make life a little bit easier for autistic staff who might be sensitive to noise and other sensory sort of stimuli, who can struggle to interact with colleagues or deal with changes. So these individual chairs where they can feel part of an organisation, but feel a little bit sort of more secluded and away, have those acoustic wings on them as well, and really helps them to sort of be able to focus. In our last session, we actually spoke about our senses, and we included light sensitivity and even to the fact that some neurodiverse individuals can hear fluorescent lighting. And obviously they can see more flickers than us as well, which is quite distracting. So you can see in the bottom right, there's a sort of a room which has that capability where you can actually have the dimmer switch in there. So you can turn up and down the lighting, and it's just a slightly calmer space for people to go in. Also, we heard that a lot of people that are neurodiverse actually appreciate wearing noise cancelling headphones. When actually open plan offices first came out, I remember walking into environments and the people in the office saying to me, look, we really want to stop people wearing headphones walking around because that's not why we created the open plan office. But I don't think they'd felt about the way that some people actually may need to because they get distracted by the noise. So having those variety of spaces and activity-based environments that offer choice, I think is a really good starting point to get in neurodiverse within your organisation. Yeah, others we've heard have had a difficult time with scents and perfumes, to the point where they have had to go home. And I think about your policies as well. So it's not just the space, but it's also behaviour and etiquette. And we had one client who brought this up to HR because she actually had a really difficult time with scents and perfumes. And when she initially brought it up, it was quite small, the team, and her boss actually stepped in and said, look, nobody wear perfume, you don't need it, don't do it, and it makes this person unwell. Now the company, unfortunately, has had hyper growth, and HR's perspective is actually to put a voluntary scent-free policy in place because they don't want to mandate. However, this means that there are days when this person goes into the office and has to just turn around and go straight back home again because of that, the smell actually really sort of sets them off. The other thing I just want to touch on, but before I hand over, is around hot desking. A lot more organisations now are looking at unassigned desking, as we've seen sort of the hybrid move into the offices. And one thing I would just make you mindful of with regards to neurodiverse individuals is they do really appreciate having a desk. The desk supports them and their processing functions as visual cues. They might have it set up a certain way, have X amount of screens, but to them that familiarity and resistance to change is quite important. Some of them actually have really extended morning routines as well. And also they like to travel when it's a little bit quieter. So to them, it's a hindrance and a waste of time and a waste of productive time for the organisation for them to have to go in and set their workstation up every day. And there's also a risk that it won't be set up right. And for them also, the desk is an expression of their personality, where sometimes they're not necessarily so verbal. To have their desk as a personality actually helps them feel like they belong to the organisation, and it creates a welcoming feel. So I just wanted to leave you with that around hot desking, and I'm going to hand over to this final poll, and then I'll hand over to Liz. So what I'm interested to understand is, does your workplace have an active hiring program for neurodivergent professionals? Hopefully the poll has popped up on your screen. Wow. Phenomenally, 100% of you said no. Oh my goodness, reach out for help. Okay, that is really interesting. Thank you very much. So Liz, that's quite a good introduction for you, isn't it?
Yes, well, I don't know what to say. I'm not desperately surprised, if I'm honest, because I think it is an area where people they just don't know where to start. And thank you, actually, for showing quite a good example from my profession. I don't know if you thought about that, but obviously I'm recruiting insight people and data scientists. So perfect, you gave a great example of how it can work. And I think, one of the things that we could do better is just demonstrate how it can work, give some positive examples as a way of overcoming the fear. The other thing I just wanted to comment on was those acoustic chairs. I love them. And I thought it was a really good example of how you can change things, and it helps not only the neurodiverse, but actually lots of us benefit from little things like that. So bringing in these changes is not just about neurodiversity, it's about supporting all of us. We've all got our quirks, haven't we? So anyway, I'll move on to my first slide, which is, so how does the applicant view your industry and your profession and your company. And I won't go over it at length, but we've talked before about that you won't encourage anybody to work in your environment if they see that particular profession or your particular company as one that is not inclusive. The insight profession has got together. The insight profession is full of lots of little small companies. It's very tech driven, it's very innovative, but that does mean we have a lot of small growing companies. And so therefore we often look to the profession as a whole to support us, because it's more difficult for little companies to do some of these things individually. And I think what has really worked has been what Gillian and Jack called affinity groups. And this is often, well, it sometimes has been the initiative of a professional association, but more commonly, it's been just one individual that's been really passionate about linking up with other individuals across the profession so that they can swap ideas and experiences. So I think, you know, if you are a little company, don't think that, oh goodness, we don't have enough staff to start this sort of group up. It's possible to do across the profession and support each other in that way. I can give a couple of examples of things that don't work. I know that's not really the spirit of this talk. I just want to say that it's quite hard to do things like set up codes of conduct that work across a profession, particularly if it's a global profession, because some of the things don't apply across different countries. So I would avoid trying to do some of those more legislative things and instead try and stick to these sorts of affinity groups. Company, again, I've talked about this a bit before, so I'll just be very brief, but I think it starts from inside. If you get the internal values right, if you get the internal communication right, then what shows to the outside is a much more inclusive company, and therefore you will encourage people to join. And I don't think I can name them, but there is a huge bank that has done lots and lots of work in this area. I've been really impressed about some of the initiatives that they've done. And you see them at every award thing, every group about it, you know, all communication, they often are brought up. And therefore, people that belong to any diverse group, actually, it doesn't just have to be neurodiversity, will feel comfortable joining that organisation. And I know that a lot more people in various minority diverse groups have joined them since they started this initiative. But start from within. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So rethinking the job description, you've got to start with this. If you think you want somebody who did exactly the same job as the one before, that job may be difficult for somebody who is neurodiverse to do in exactly the same way. I don't know the article about the data scientist, but I'm sure that what he is doing is slightly different from previous data scientists they have employed, but nevertheless, he clearly offers a great service. This guy that redesigned the account system, you know, he's done it in a different way and therefore better. If we can rethink the job description to bring in these skills, it's really important. I'm not surprised it's no. I find it difficult to think of examples where people have moved from like to for like. But one of the things that people are commonly doing is dropping the need for educational qualifications. And obviously that does make it easier for people who are very talented but may not have done as well academically at school to still be considered. So I think it's very important we carry on with that. Something else I'd quite like Linky's view on is anonymised CVs. Now, a lot of clients are moving towards anonymised CVs where you don't even know somebody's educational qualifications. You know very, very little about them. And in this way, clients feel that they are not able to be biased in who they select for interview. But I feel that that's just pushing the problem further down the line. And actually, if the person that's interviewing them is still in some way not as open to neurodiverse people as someone else, then the fact it's an anonymised CV makes no difference. But I would like to hear Linky's view. Next slide. So promoting the vacancy. Obviously, it's very important to encourage all to apply. You don't want to say, oh, only the neurodiverse can apply, because that's clearly not allowing everybody to apply. But you can word it so that it's very clear that you welcome applications from the neurodiverse. The next thing to think about when you're writing an advert is thinking about the language, particularly if you're asking for very specific skills. Some people may feel very nervous that that's not something that applies to them. You may make the process seem very laboured, which somebody that's neurodiverse feels they can't follow through with. So it's thinking about how you word all those things so that the advert is inclusive, it welcomes all to apply. And then finally, adverts in themselves are not actually that inclusive. For some people, applying for an ad, they just don't feel confident to do it. I mean, if you think that, I think it's, is it 80%? It's nearly 80% of autistic people are not in work. If you're not in work, then you're not going to be regularly looking at job adverts, because you're just going to dismiss the idea of work being for you. So then you have to think about other approaches. So possibly reaching out to charities. There are a lot of charities that try and support the neurodiverse into the workplace. You can do trials, and I know of companies, in fact, I think Microsoft do this, take on large groups of people on a trial basis. And this not only allows people to come in and show you, rather than through interviews, show you what they can do, but also allows both of you to learn about what the problems are with all problems, opportunities, but what changes you need to make to take on somebody that is neurodiverse. So just think about trying some other approaches. Apprenticeships, that's another thing that organisations are doing. Next slide, please. The selection process. There's a lot that you can say about this. I'm not going to talk about positive action again, because we covered it in the last webinar. If you haven't seen Linky's summary of positive action, then I urge you to look at the past webinar. We've also made a separate clip of it, because it's something that I have never really understood, and Linky makes it really clear. But I guess the summary is there are lots of different things that you can do to support neurodiverse and other diverse groups into a job. But one of the things you can't do is you can't have selective shortlists, things like neurodiverse shortlist. The next thing is referrals. Now, again, I'd be interested in Linky's opinion on this. Referral schemes are very common. It's certainly in my profession, people promoting roles through their own workforce, feeling that this is a very good way of getting I suppose, guaranteed, but, you know, a talent that is known to others and therefore likely to be of a good quality. But the problem is that then that you are reaching out within your own network. You're not reaching out to these new pools of people. So is referrals the best way of recruitment? There are pluses and minuses. References, that's another area actually, and again I'd be interested in Linky's view, but do you get references? Because again, you are reaching out to people within a particular network and therefore not getting the views of people outside that network and people that might be slightly different, but that doesn't mean to say that they can't do the job well. Improving the interview process, there are lots and lots of ideas on this. I picked out a few. So I was talking to the HR director of a huge pharmaceutical company who'd learned sign language, for example, so that he could be absolutely sure that if that was necessary, he was, as an organisation, they were able to support that. A lot of larger companies make sure that they have an interview board that represents various minority groups, much more easily done, of course, for a large company than a small. We've recently worked with a charity who employed somebody that is dyslexic. They sent them the interviews questions in advance. ENI, we do competency interviews, which is looking at people's innate skills. So it doesn't matter what background they've come from, they have those innate skills, again, as a way of trying to make us as inclusive as possible. Going back to Linky's point, you've got to make sure that you keep a process, an interview process that can be measured and where you can keep accurate records, so that if people go back and question that, you can be absolutely sure that you have done it fairly. Interviewing is still something in this country we tend to just sort of have a chat, and in that way, it's, you know, it's not. You can't be sure that you are giving everybody a fair chance. Finally, then of course you can have no interview, and in a way I've already covered this, but there are all sorts of things that you can do, like getting people in for a trial rather than going through an interview. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about access to work, which until I started on this journey, I knew nothing about, and I don't think many of my clients know anything about. At the moment, this is something like 62,900, I think, that the government gives to any disabled employee to help them in the workplace. So it does go to the employee, but they are all work-related things that the government is prepared to fund. And 62,900 is a lot of money. You know, that can really be used to make quite a difference. There are three key ways that it should be used. One is, so any extra cost of employing that person in the workplace, it might be the acoustic chairs, it might be some sort of special software. There's all sorts of things that you might want to think about in order to make your environment more supportive of the neurodiverse. The second one is to support mental health in the workplace. So obviously having encouraged these people to join your organisation, you then want to make sure that's a success. So what can you do to support that? The next and the last area is communication support. So anything that may help that individual communicate and work with the team around them. Gillian, you're laughing. I hope I've got that right. Yes. And I wanted to give a real example of this. Last weekend, I met a community nurse who had worked a lot with autistic people, and her job had been to go into the workplace and literally shadow them for their first 6 weeks and help them with just learning, you know, taking on all in the information, working with their colleagues, just supporting them through until they had got into the routine of it and they were felt very comfortable in the environment. And then after 6 weeks, she would work with somebody else. Now, unfortunately, the NHS have cut the budget for this. So, you know, she's not able to do that work anymore. But I would have thought that organisations should be able to bring in people like her and fund it through access to work. So that's an idea. Next slide, please. Yes, I just finally wanted to cover 2 things. So we measure not only the people that register with us as a recruitment agency, but also that actually go out for interview and that we get jobs. We measure them by various diversity groupings, including physical and neurodiverse. And the reason that we are measuring them is that we are putting practices in place to ensure that we get better, but we can't actually see what's working and what isn't if we're not measuring it. And certainly I have found that clients that similarly are measuring it are making particular efforts to change things. And I think what you don't measure is often it's easy to, well, not ignore, but, you know, when in a busy working world, to think about other things. If it's measured, if there are targets, you're more likely to change things and make a difference. We're actually measuring it through Diversely. I put their logo there, but there are lots of other ways of doing it. You can even just do it yourselves on a spreadsheet, but you've got to be very careful. Obviously, you comply with GDPR, again, Linky, you could probably comment on that. And the final thing is diversity and inclusion support groups. Now, I have been really interested in this area for probably 18 months, and I have joined a number of groups, including includability and the ability people. And these have been fantastic support groups. Organisations of all sorts belong to them, all sizes, and they have regular meetings to allow people to get together, exchange ideas, talk about different training things, talk about good examples, what's worked and what's not. I would really urge people to look at joining groups like this, because I can't believe how helpful they've been. They will do other sorts of things too. They'll do things like audit your website and check that, you know, it's as inclusive as possible. But actually, for me, it's the chance to chat to others and learn from them, which has been really useful. And finally, I just want to give a big shout to Jenny, who trained me in the area of balance of diversity and inclusion in the first place. And yeah, so there are some great trainers out there, and I think that's also a very good start. Thank you. Sorry, I talked far too long.
Thanks very much, Liz. It's always interesting hearing all these other perspectives. You've given me lots of questions to respond to. I think given the time, and in fact, we've had a couple of really interesting questions sent in through some of those attending. I think given the time, we will probably leave questions until our next session, or maybe our 5th recorded session, where we will pick these up. But there's some really interesting sort of discussion points coming through, so we'll pick those up in future sessions. I just wanted to touch on common issues that I see in practice. Last seminar, I had a look at the sort of legal obligations that employers are under when employing disabled staff. But to be honest, the ones I see most often in practice in relation to disability, and neurodiversity will fall into the definition of disability almost certainly, so it has the protections under the Equality Act. The ones I see in practice are discrimination arising from a disability, where someone is treated less favourably because of something arising from their disability, which is not, sorry, typo there, my terrible handwriting for whoever was kindly doing the slides for me, which is not a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, and reasonable adjustments. That is a positive obligation for the employer to make reasonable adjustments to any provision, criteria or practice known as a PCP, where the disabled employee is placed at a substantial disadvantage by reason of that PCP. And even in just reading that out, I'm conscious that that's just a lot of words. And, you know, when you break it down, you know, what does it mean? What does it really mean in practice? And actually, I think it's worth trying to grapple with it, because if you follow the process that this legal structure creates, it very often demonstrates what the answer is. It shows you what the answer is. So a practical example, starting with discrimination arising from disability, the first thing to remember is that it's not necessary for the employer to be aware that the issue that arises for the employee is in consequence, that the something arises from their disability. Just knowledge of the something is happening, is sufficient. So if, for instance, I was trying to think of a practical example, but let's think somebody who has dyspraxia and as a result, huge light sensitivity. And as Gillian was saying, you know, some people can hear the fluorescent lighting. You know, their sort of senses are so finely tuned and can be completely diverting. So they go into a sort of an open plan office with all of the other members of the team, and they always turn the main lights off. And then they sit nearest the window, and then other employees who aren't near the window sort of start complaining, you know, I need the light on. And they say, well, I don't want the light on. And so the employer decides to deal that by telling the individual who turns them off, please don't turn the lights off, because, you know, other members of the team can't see them, but they continue to do so. So they're refusing to comply with a reasonable management instruction. They keep turning the lights off. Tensions arising within that team. And the employer therefore puts them through a disciplinary process. Now that disciplinary process is less favourable treatment because of something arising from their disability. That's discrimination arising from a disability. Now, I have discussions with employers all day, every day about these sorts of issues, and they go, well, my God, what am I supposed to do? You know, this individual is causing real issues in the team. You know, some people aren't next to a window, so they don't get natural light, and so they can't see their screens. And, you know, isn't it bad for their eyes if their screens have to be turned up brighter so they can see? Well, the answer is you move on to the question of not justification at this stage. You don't look at justification, you look at reasonable adjustments, and you move on to your obligation about reasonable adjustments. I think on the next slide, I just touch on some examples from case law of what has been found to amount to something arising from somebody's disability: an inability to work unaided, need for more regular rest breaks. Just as an example, when I was undertaking a public sector role within the employment tribunals, we were all trained in equality and diversity. And we had this fabulous speaker who came to talk to us about neurodiversity. And she was an extremely good presenter. And she, you know, absolutely engaged us all for 2.5 hours during one afternoon. really educating us about neurodiversity. Things like don't use idioms in the courtroom. Don't say things like, well, is that the tail wagging the dog? If you're neurodiverse and in a stressful situation, what you want is plain language to help them understand what on earth is going on in a really unfamiliar environment. But she had autism, and as a result, what she explained was that she is a good presenter, and she can present these things and impart really complicated issues in quite a sort of simple to understand way. But she gets incredibly exhausted. She gets more sort of drained by doing a 2.5-hour session than somebody who is not neurodiverse. And therefore, she needed more regular rest breaks. What she would do is probably only do morning sessions, have the afternoon to sort of decompress from having, done that sort of role, and then pick up work later on preparing for the next seminar. It's just a matter of adjustments. Difficulties in using public transport support. This is what the Equality and Human Rights Commission Code has identified. These are all arise or can arise from somebody's neurodiversity. And in fact, we touched on that in the last session about changing start times. Need for specialist computer equipment. My nephew's terribly dyslexic. He sort of sometimes needs to change the color or the font or whatever way it works for him to be able to read the text more easily. And the need for a private or quiet working environment. Again, as Gillian and Jack were talking about, these sort of hot desking arrangements sometimes are really challenging for neurodiverse members of staff. They want their things on their desk, they want to know where they're going to sit, they want the lighting to be consistent. And that is exactly the sort of difficulty that can arise from a sort of general PCP, provision criteria or practice that is applied. You will sit here in this environment, in this desk, at this window, under this light. No, you can't have anything on your desk. Those are all PCPs that are being applied. They're all provision criteria and practices, and therefore they can all create scope for discrimination arising from a disability. Others that I've come across is, not brightly lit, intolerance. Gillian has spoken of this, intolerance of strong smells or perfumes or aftershaves. A lot of companies are rolling out sort of policies that sort of touch on this, to have a no sort of perfumes or aftershave policy. Aggression, there are a few cases which relate to people who react particularly aggressively when under stress and difficulty, and that aggression can be something that arises from their disability. It doesn't mean that you have to just tolerate somebody who's constantly head-butting their colleagues. But it means you've got to have a more structured way that you approach it. And the first one is looking at reasonable adjustments. So if we go on to the next slide, what is the provisional criteria you are adjusting? I've heard people say, well, I need them to work autonomously. I can't create this buddy mentor scheme you're talking about, Linky. I need them to work autonomously. That's the provision criteria or practice. I need staff to be at their workstation during work hours. I want them there from 9 till 6. Well, why? Why do you need them there from 9 till 6? Can you not do, 10 till 7 or whatever? And yes, for some workplaces, you do need them there. Helplines, call centres, shift patterns. There is probably an issue around being able to adjust the shift pattern that particular individual is on. And yes, it may well be that they always get the 10 till 7 shift. But if that is a reasonable adjustment that alleviates that disadvantage, then that is what you should implement. This need to start work at 9, the requirement to use the equipment given without any modification. No, we're not going to get that software. No, we're not going to have any other sort of external aids that help. These are all reasonable adjustments that the employer should consider. The requirement to be polite and courteous to colleagues and clients, that is a PCP. And you might have to adjust it. You might have to sort of say, look, sometimes under pressure, there can be an outburst. I mean, Tourette's is the easiest example. you know, you may be able to garner greater understanding and tolerance with education in your workplace. That may be more difficult if they're answering calls to clients. You know, and that sort of external facing role, it may not be possible to make a reasonable adjustment to accommodate that. And that's fine, but you need to think about it and you need to justify it and you need to understand what is the provision criteria or practice and what is the adjustment that you are implementing. So once you've identified your PCP, I advocate that the adjustment usually presents itself. What the case law says, what the law says is that you can consider all of the following factors. Does the adjustment have any prospect of removing the substantial disadvantage? You don't have to remove the disadvantage altogether. Believe me, neurodiverse staff are quite used to working at some disadvantage. The question is whether or not it's a substantial disadvantage. That's the test for discrimination arising from and the requirement to make an adjustment. And as long as the PCP removes some of the disadvantage, then it is one that should be implemented with taking into account the other factors. Is it practicable? What is the cost? Is there an external finance or assistance available? So what Liz was talking about, access to work, my goodness, look at that. You know, that can really help. That sounds like a substantive amount of money. Is it practical to have somebody else there in the first sort of 3 weeks, 6 weeks of their training, supplied by Access to Work to help them go through all the training that they've got to do on health and safety and the new, you know, IT system and that sort of thing? Probably is. Why wouldn't it be? You know, maybe if you're, you know, working with high trade secrets that, you know, I don't know, the Coca-Cola formula, it may not be appropriate to have someone from outside the organization doing that shadowing, but you can probably adjust the training so that it can be done external to that sort of unit that has highly sensitive information. And you can take into account the nature and size of the employer's business. So you look at that adjustment, it will present itself. And if having looked at it, you've looked at what your PCP is, you've looked at what the adjustment is, and for legitimate reasons, you've determined, look, it's not possible to make an adjustment that will alleviate the substantial disadvantage. And if that's the case, then you move on to the question of justification. And justification is it a proportionate means? Is the discrimination I'm subjecting this individual to a proportionate means of achieving what my legitimate aim is? So let's take, for example, you know, you're working with the Coca-Cola formula, it's highly confidential, and they want somebody to come in and help them with IT training from an external organization that's being paid for by Access to Work. Your legitimate aim is to keep the information confidential. And if you can't do that training without disclosing that confidential information, it may be that therefore not being able to train them or not being able to train them in that way, which is a disadvantage, it may be that it's a proportionate means of achieving that legitimate aim. But you've got to focus on what is your legitimate aim and what are the ways that we can do, what adjustments can we do in order to achieve that legitimate aim without creating some sort of discrimination for that particular individual. The other legitimate aims that we've heard is maintaining high standards of work and implementing effective control and management of company finances. And that is the legitimate aim in the context of sick pay. So a big fight and a big sort of ground of debate is, look, if somebody is off sick because of something arising from their disability, do I have to continue to pay them? And when do I start? A lot of people have these sort of standard formulas for when you start implementing disciplinary proceedings for absence as a capability dismissal because you're absent too often. And do they have to adjust the trigger points for those absences? The answer is yes, they do have to adjust the trigger points for those absences where it arises as a result of a disability, but not to the extent that, you know, that's fine if you know, are never able to turn up for work that's fine because it arises from your disability. That's clearly nonsense. You know, they're employed to work. So yes, you have to make some sort of adjustment, but it has to be a reasonable adjustment so that you can achieve your legitimate aim of implementing effective control and management of company finances and having people in work and being able to do the job that they're employed to do. So I'm conscious of time, very quick summary. Does the something that's happening, the disciplinary proceedings, whatever it is, arise from the disability? And my advice would be assume so until consultation or medical evidence suggests otherwise. Look at what is the provision criteria or practice that's being applied. Sit here in that space, at that work desk, under that light, in this office. Those are all PCPs. Can you make a reasonable adjustment? It has to be a reasonable adjustment in order to alleviate the substantial disadvantage, not completely eliminate it, just alleviate the substantial element of it. And if so, make those adjustments. And you see if that substantial disadvantage and therefore the less favourable treatment dissipates. And if it doesn't, and there is an ongoing problem, then you move on to the question of, is that discriminatory treatment a proportionate means of achieving my legitimate aim? What is my legitimate aim? And is this a proportionate response? So that's a sort of very quick run through. I think the slides will help sort of structure your thinking. So anybody who's attended, if you do want to have the slides, do ask us to email copies of them to you, and we'd be very happy to do so. Conscious of time, we've detained you all for too long as it is. We will definitely deal with the questions and the comments in our next session because there's some really interesting questions that have been raised. Particularly one about examples of professions and various types that particularly suit neurodiverse individuals. And I'm sure we've all got something to say on that. But thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers. And we will see you at the next session, hopefully, which I think is on the 8th of June. Look forward to seeing you then. Many thanks.
Thank you.